You're listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, actually someone who wrote in and wanted to tell his own story on the podcast. We always love those guests who raise their hand and say, hey, I want to be part of the show. So this is going to be a very exciting episode. Just a couple of quick notes. As always, don't forget to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Of course, make sure you are leaving your Apple reviews. These things are so critical, guys. I don't know why Apple does their algorithm the way they do, but this is what they do. And the more reviews we get, the more stars that we get, the more popular this show is to the Apple community. So we want to crack the top 100 Apple podcasts, but we need your help to do it. So please leave a rating and a review anywhere you get your Apple podcasts, and you can help grow the show. Speaking of growing, we'd love to be able to make some more donations, and we can do that with you through our partnership with Amazon. You go to our website, hazardground.com. You can click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab, and it'll direct you right to Amazon. You do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities you've heard featured here on the show. And so with the holidays coming up, please put that in the back of your mind, that if you're going to go to Amazon, do some early Christmas shopping, early holiday shopping, whatever it may be, make sure you go to hazardground.com first. On to this week's guest, who is a former Army captain and an Army Ranger who served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He was a ground force commander who served 4 total deployments, 2 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. He was awarded a Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Medal for Valor. He's also a former Pat Tillman military scholar and the author of the acclaimed novel, And the Whole Mountain Burned, and his own memoir, We March at Midnight. He is RRay McPadden joining us on the Hazard Ground podcast. Ray, welcome, man, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Certainly appreciate it. So We March at Midnight, the memoir about war, leadership, and family. Just an incredible book. We certainly are well familiar with it, and congratulations on all the success on all the books and all the authoring that you have done over the past couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's been fun to get the stories out there and have good feedback on them. So thank you.
Well, and I'm always curious, for people who raise their hand, because we're always looking for guest suggestions, right? We love it when listeners, email us and turn around and say, hey, we'd like to hear this story, we'd like to hear that story. But I'm always curious as to what prompted you to want to tell your story, because you reached out to us with an email. And again, we love it. I mean, it's great. We encourage a lot of listeners and people who have whatever their story is to come and tell it on the show. So what was kind of your impetus?
Well, I listened to the show. I listen to podcasts driving back and forth to work. I work in Yellowstone. It's kind of a long, dark commute, and yeah, you guys keep me company. So I was like, hey, I'd love to be part of this. So that's the impetus behind it. So
excellent. Well, again, thank you for raising your hand. And some people don't have the courage to tell their story because they don't think it's big enough or it's important enough. But as we always say, every story that we tell has its own level of importance. It does not matter whether you are a private or you are a 3-star general. We treat them all the same. So we're glad you stepped up to tell yours. But start at the beginning of your story and how and why you got in the Army.
I got in, really September 11th. I mean, it was easy for me, Mark. Saw the towers come down. I was like 18, 19 at the time.
Oh, really?
And that was like, that's it. I know what I'm going to do.
Were you in high school, or do you remember exactly where you were?
Freshman in college. Yeah. So it was had just started college. Yeah. I knew I wanted to be military. My dad was a career naval officer. So I always kind of had this idea that I was going to go into the military, but who and where, what branch and what I wanted to do, all that was pretty fuzzy. And I was still trying to figure it out. And, obviously September 11th changed it, where it was revenge was on my mind. I wanted to go fight. I wanted to kill bad guys. So I got on that trajectory, basically right after 9/11.
Were you doing ROTC at the time or anything, or did you just quit college altogether?
So I actually stayed in, and because my inclination, right, was I'm going to go enlist because, there's going to be an invasion. There's going to be a war. I don't know what's going to happen exactly, but I want in on this, and I don't want to miss out. And it was, I was talking to the ROTC program, and I was in the Corps Cadets there too, but again, not necessarily on the sort of contract Army route yet. And it was the old Ranger Battalion NCO guy. He was in second bat too. And he told me, don't go enlist. Like, hold your horses there. Trust me, you want to finish school. And he had some wisdom in saying, this fight's it's not going to be over anytime soon. This is going to go on for a long time. And he'd been in combat. He'd been in Panama. He'd done some other kind of secret squirrel things. And so I thought really highly of him, and I took that advice and thought and decided to go ahead and like get on the ROTC route and get commissioned and kind of wait. So it was hard to do, Mark. It was hard to kind of like make that leap of faith of the war's not going anywhere. But ultimately, obviously, he was right, and I'm glad I stayed on that track.
Yeah, little did we know 20 years later that we would have still been doing this. We all thought the war was going to pass us by, and a generation passed by and we were still doing it. So crazy to think. I was actually commissioned at the time already, and I had just gotten off active duty when 9/11 happened. So it was kind of a full on neutral drop and heading in the other direction for me. So when do you actually end up commissioning? What year?
It was basically like Christmas 2004. So I went, I got my commission, I think like New Year's Day, 2005.
Gotcha.
And then started the infantry officer basic course, within a week or two of graduating from A&M. I graduated like kind of Christmas timeframe, and then went right to Fort Benning. I mean, it was all kind of lined up pretty fast. So
you knew during ROTC that you were going infantry the whole way.
Yeah, you had to, right? You had to compete for it.
Yeah.
It's at least on the officer, for the officer side. It's funny, right? Because like it was, used to be like Vietnam. It was like, oh gosh, like the infantry was for all the people that didn't do well in their ASVAB or whatever.
All the idiots. Well,
yeah, it's like but
I went to ROTC. We had to compete for it as well, but you had to compete not to get infantry. Otherwise, you were going infantry, and that was pre 9/11. So if you were stupid, you were going infantry. If you were halfway smart, you got something else.
Right. Yeah. But I think in the modern era, at least for me, like infantry was the most competitive, thing. And so I tried very hard in college. I did a lot of like extracurricular things. I went to some Army schools, graduated from some Army schools, did really well academically. And so, I got infantry. And then the other thing was you got to pick your, you got to like pick your unit. I say that air quotes pick. So you got, I don't know if you remember this, Mark, but you would do, okay, here's my list. And you
go, your order of merit list of the 10.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
my first 5 were in Germany, 6 was in Italy, 7 was Hawaii. And I ended up at Fort Hood, Texas.
Exactly. I think everybody's
merit list.
I think everybody's order of merit list is the same, right? Yep. It's everybody like picks the exotic locations first. And I remember my number one was Vicenza, Italy. Like I wanted to go to 173rd because I was like, Italy, cool, and airborne, and I don't remember where, like 10th Mountain was in the top 5, but it wasn't, certainly wasn't the top 1. So I got assigned to 10th Mountain, but I was cool with that because I knew like kind of the old school like ski and mountaineering history of 10th Mountain, and I'd been a climbing ranger for the National Park Service, like a seasonal gig, and I'd been to mountaineering school. The Army sent me to mountaineering school, so I was like, yeah, this is cool. I'm excited, and I'm glad it worked out, and 10th Mountain was a good fit for me.
Yeah, I remember there were certain posts they said don't put it on there or you'll automatically get it, and Fort Drum was one of them. Because nobody wants to go live in 10 feet of snow 8 months out of the year. So I avoided that like the plague, thankfully. Instead, I got, dry, hot rock desert in central Texas. So, live and let live, I suppose. By the way, when you were in college and Iraq had kicked off, did that fear of missing the war sort of go away immediately? Because now you had 2 wars?
Yeah, I think so. for me, I always wanted to go to Afghanistan. I was like, Iraq, I could care less about Iraq. You know, to me, it was like, there was that immediate and very clear link between 9/11 and Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda. And that's where I wanted to be. I mean, 100%. And Iraq was just sort of this thing in the background. And what was interesting is like, as Iraq really got going, I mean, it kind of sucked all the air out of the room. And like, that's what all everybody was talking about. And Afghanistan sort of went into the background for a while. But for me, it was always very clear that I wanted to go to Afghanistan. And so when I got to drum, I actually had orders to go to a unit that was coming back from Iraq. And that was unacceptable for me. I was like, I mean, you talk about like being a young, like second lieutenant, and you don't want to go to a unit that just come back from combat. You know, you can be completely irrelevant. And so, you know,
already irrelevant as a second lieutenant. Now it makes you more irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's already hard enough to be like a cherry leader. And so I basically went to division to the S1, you know, as a colonel. And, I said, hey, I'm supposed to be in Afghanistan, and I want on the next thing. I want on the next thing going over there. And she, she thought, I think, kind of her body language and her initial reaction coming in was she thought I had showed up to try to get out of the deployment, because the wars had been going for a little bit. And I think people were starting to, kind of look for cush jobs and such. And so I think I surprised her by, going in there and basically begging, grabbing her leg and begging to go to Afghanistan. And, but she gave me orders right there. And
oh, wow.
Yeah. She was like, here, go away.
What about Afghanistan? Just out of my office.
Yeah. Just leave me alone. And so I got assigned to a infantry battalion, 132 infantry, that was basically in the final phase of their train up to go to Afghanistan. So I got exactly what I wanted, Mark.
Did you get a platoon right away?
No, I didn't. I had to wait. And so the way it works for like units that are kind of gearing up, or at least, right, at the time, was they would plus you up with like a lot of extra bodies. And it's I didn't know it at the time, right? But it's like they're just getting like the unit ready for casualties, where there's people in the unit who can fill in immediately. So I went in, I was kind of extra for a while, but I didn't have to wait long. It was like, I kind of did some things, kind of some staff work. I did some other things and got to know the battalion commander pretty well. So learned a lot from him. And then, basically within, just a week or two of deploying, I was actually put into a platoon.
Gotcha. Okay. So what year, month is this when you first leave for Afghanistan?
We got there in February 2006.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Slow time over there in February.
Slow time.
Yeah.
Right. It was. So here's the other thing going on, like in the Army at the time, right? It was like, everybody was like, hey, the war, like if you want to get in the shit, you go to Iraq.
Yeah.
Like, Iraq was like,
when I was
really, it was really messy.
You
had Fallujah, Ramadi, like all those big stories were coming out. And, Iraq was kind of where you went to like really, get in the fight. And in Afghanistan, right, you had the initial window, the invasion, right, where it was like, man, that invasion. I mean, it's so like romantic and sexy, the initial invasion of Afghanistan, but then everything quieted down. And then it was like, Afghanistan, you go over there, you get some cool hiking in, you take some cool pictures, but it wasn't really seen as like the hot war. But what happened is, right, like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they kind of went to ground, and a lot of them went over to Pakistan for a while. And what happened is, like, right in 2006 was when they ramped up in a huge way. And so Afghanistan was kind of chill. Our troop levels had really kind of come down considerably.
I think there were about 15, under 20,000 at that point in time.
Yeah. And that's when the war, I think, in terms of like the Taliban really being extremely aggressive, kind of reconstituting themselves and like actually launching offensives, really started in 2006. So what was an interesting thing about that for me, Mark, was like we were, in many cases, like we were actually outnumbered. Like, numerically, we were like we were pretty under strength. And it took the Army a while to kind of recognize that, like, what the Taliban was doing. And so we were in that weird period where the war took off again, but we didn't really have the people,
right,
to sort of like to fight back. I think the way we really needed to. So it was that obviously factored into my first tour.
Right.
So,
well, and again, for frame of reference for, civilians listening, just think about this, if they're under 20,000 in Afghanistan at the time, when everything went down at the Afghanistan airport, we'd send 5,000 people in just to secure an airport. Right. I mean, we sent 5,000 troops back in to secure an airport. So a force 4 times the size of that, or less than 4 times the size, was there to secure an entire country at the time. That's how small, we had drawn down from Afghanistan at that point in time. So stands to reason, obviously, why Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were able to sort of reconstitute and set themselves back up. So when you get there, where are you in Afghanistan and what is your mission?
So we go to Kunar province.
Okay.
And we go into the Korengal Valley. We are the first unit to establish a permanent presence in the Korengal Valley. Wow. So just like bookends with some other things that are pretty well known, Mark, like Operation Red Wings, right? Marcus Luttrell's The Lone Survivor. That's right there in that valley, right on kind of the high ground. And that event precipitated, it was like, hey, there's this gigantic enemy presence here. We have to be aggressive in combating them. So part of what happened afterwards, we essentially went in and established the first outpost. We said, we're going to go into their terrain. We're going to go into their backyard. We're going to own it. We're going to kick their ass. And that was the basic mission. We were the first ones to go in there and try to actually like live and establish a presence. And
how much were you meeting with the locals?
At first, like we were doing like coin, like, hearts and minds, like, let's build relationships, right? It's basic doctrine. It's like, okay,
right.
Establish relationships, like get to know people, separate the enemy from the population. And sure. we learned pretty quickly that the enemy was the population. I shit you not, like everybody in the valley was like, we don't want you here. And some were, there was Al-Qaeda, there was Taliban, and there's also a lot of just like the Korengalis themselves are, like the ultimate like gangsters, like they are just like, hey, they're badasses, and they don't want anybody in their backyard, really. Like, Westerners, the infidel types, like they're just a very, kind of isolated, like mountain people. And so, we quickly found that we were, not just fighting Al-Qaeda, who was kind of the primary like targets, and some of the higher level Taliban commanders who had sought haven in the area. We were fighting the entire population, everybody. So it was like within like 2 or 3 weeks, we kind of realized like I was going
to say, how quickly did the operational tempo pick up and the enemy contact pick up?
It was kind of like, this was all in the span of like just a few weeks, right? So we went in and we did this big operation, and we pushed a lot of and like this is like guerrilla warfare, like 101, right? So they saw we had this big sort of presence. We made this big offensive into the valley, gotten some fights, but largely they saw how strong we were and they fled. And then as we started to draw down and we went to our permanent presence, which is basically a company's going to own this valley. It's about 9-10 miles long, give or take, fairly large land area. And we're going to control that with a company of infantry from the Army. They all started to re-infiltrate the valley, all the kind of the foreign fighters, the other big sort of like Taliban affiliates that were, part of the bigger, campaign in Kunar. They all came back in. So within about 3 weeks of us kind of going, hey, it's just us here now, it got really nasty. And the fights were, at first it was a lot of frequent contact. It was like 3 or 4 times a day. Like we were in like shootouts. And they weren't huge yet. They weren't huge. We were taking casualties. We had KIAs, we had WIAs, but they weren't like huge quite yet, but they were just it was just constant fire.
For somebody who wanted to prove themselves and want to go to war and get bad guys, when one of your first guys gets killed or wounded for that matter, do you look at that decision a little bit differently?
Yeah, you certainly do. And so we're learning. There hadn't really been any, like, we're off the map in many ways, and we're in very much like uncharted territory. And so we're like learning too, where you don't have, a lot of experience in this type of terrain. You don't truly know like the enemy strength. And so, you're kind of like feeling your way through it. And yeah, we started to have, we had some KIAs early on, and that, obviously, wakes you up. And I certainly, tactically you start to, take it much, much more seriously. And I think probably the biggest adjustment we made early on was trying to do more like night operations. Like we thought we could move around the valley and kind of find like in the daylight. And what we found was, just because of the terrain, you have this extreme terrain, like, 11, 12, 13,000 foot peaks all around you. You have cliffs, you just raging like mountain streams. And you also had, very like barren kind of hillsides down low, where it was really easy to kind of spot people moving around. Our patrols were easily spotted. And then up high, you had really thick forests, like big, huge old growth forests, conifers, pines. So just this wild landscape and this vertical battlefield. And anyway, so point being, it was hard to move around undetected. And so because of the severity of the terrain too, like it was pretty easy. Moving was like really slow going. So you would often find yourself in a position where, the enemy could like maneuver on you fairly quickly. And then, you're moving very slowly, and they catch you on the side of a hill. Mm-hmm. And they line up one machine gun on you, and they can just, they could literally take out everybody. It's just very, very taxing to try to move there. And it's very easy for the enemy to maneuver on you.
Did you get a sense that you might've been overmatched from that standpoint, with the terrain being the biggest challenge?
We learned, it was challenging. Like I thought we were really fit. Like we knew where we were going more or less, and we trained up for it. And, we did a lot of things like in the mountains, and mm-hmm. we had a lot of young, obviously young, really fit guys. But those first few movements over there, it was really messy. It was really messy. And, we had a lot of terrain injuries, casualties from terrain, guys falling off of cliffs, we had guys drown in the rivers. We're literally moving with ropes. Like we're doing rope bridges. We're doing kind of, sort of like low grade, like kind of climbing. It was intense. So we definitely lost people from just the terrain alone. And it took us probably a solid month to like really get our legs under us. And then once we did, like we were incredibly fit. We were incredibly fit, mm-hmm. where it was like the shit we were capable, like what we could do, like even in the dark, was amazing. Obviously it's the best shape I've ever been in. And like my first platoon, like the fitness level, like we'll take a Delta, like we could take Delta out, we'd break them the fuck off. We'd break them off. Like I could take my Ranger platoon out, we would have broke them off. And I mean, so it was cool, like kind of how fit and how good we got at moving in that terrain, but it came with a cost to get there, right? We lost people just from the terrain alone.
By the way, did you get your Ranger tab before you deployed?
Oh yeah.
So, but that means that's a lot of quick schooling from the time you graduated to the time you deployed.
It was, yeah. It was all, I mean, it was just like boom, 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 boom.
Bam. Yeah. Okay. All right.
You were over there.
Glossed over that before.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it had happened before or after. And then you said Ranger platoon. Okay. I mean, I guess it makes sense. But nonetheless, again, you finish IOBC and right off to Fort Benning for Ranger School, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. It was like, I lined them all up. I mean, it was like, I would have like a break, like I think between like IOBC and Ranger School, I maybe had like a week or two, and they just like make you go out and like rake leaves and shit. Like between, like, oh, we don't know what to do. Like as lieutenants, just, go rake leaves out at Fort Benning.
Yeah.
And then Ranger School, and then Ranger School into Airborne School, and then Air Assault School.
Oh, wow. So you spent the first year of your military career in school.
Yeah. Just constant schooling. And I mean, all excellent training. And the other kind of two things I did that were, I thought were super cool. Like we did this once I got to drum, because that was like, again, it was like just kind of the train up, right, that we were doing, was we went to like a tracking school. We learned how to track people, right? Like how to follow sign, like footprints. And then we went to a horse packing and like mule packing course. We learned how to work with horses, mules, donkeys, like how to stick supplies on them, because we knew like we were, logistically going to have a lot of challenges. And so we were trying to get ready for like this, like a completely like archaic way of fighting, right? Whereas like it's all on foot. We're using like donkeys, mules, like you can't depend on helicopters, and you sure as shit aren't gonna be able to drive anywhere. So that's, we knew what we were getting into, and we trained for it as best we could, but there was just kind of nothing that could quite replicate the conditions of the Hindu Kush range for us. So it was there was a huge learning curve, Mark.
That first deployment, 15 months, right?
Yeah, 15. Yeah, closer to 1.6, closer to 16 for, I think for most of us, especially kind of
Welcome
on the
Army
side.
Though,
yeah, where you kind of go over there, and there was kind of some front end and some back end stuff. So about 16 months, and it was originally 12, right?
Right.
And that was and then we kind of toward the tail end we got extended, so it ended up being 16 months, and that was 16 months. Like out of a rucksack, like that was not, we were not in like the bigger bases,
But that's what you signed up for, man.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It was like, this is like, we kind of talked about this a little bit, and there's kind of a lot to unpack around it, but it was like for me, and I think for a lot of the guys that were with me, it was like, this is what war is supposed to be. This is what it's supposed to look like. Right. It's not supposed to look like,
right.
Yeah, it's not supposed to look like driving around a fucking Humvee getting blown up in Iraq by a bomb. It's like, this is a real shooting war on foot, like squad on squad, platoon on platoon with the enemy. And it was, so it was like this very like stripped down like mode of fighting. And it was like, you could not have asked for a better situation in terms of like what I wanted. I mean, it really was like Ranger School. Like it was like Ranger School patrols, like especially the mountain phase of Ranger School. I mean, that's what it was, front to, like from beginning to end.
Good old Dahlonega, Georgia. So after you get back from that deployment, what's next for you? How quickly do you go on to another one?
I went to the Ranger, like basically it's called RRay, and it's for the officers, right? To get into the Ranger Regiment. It's about three weeks and some change. And I went within maybe 2 or 3 weeks of getting back from that tour. I went to RRay.
Okay.
And that was, that was the program for like.
Is that the choice you made, or the Army told you were doing that?
Well, I wanted to go to the Ranger Regiment. That was right. That was a goal from the beginning, right? And so for officers, you can't like opt, like, so if you're enlisted, you can opt for the Ranger Regiment, right? Like there's sort of a pathway for that. But for officers, you have to go to the line, you like conventional Army first. There's no route like straight into like JSOC for officers. Yeah. So you had to go to the line first, and you had to get your tab too. Like you had to be Ranger qualified, which the enlisted guys go in and then they usually go to Ranger school later. But you had to go to Ranger school on the front end. So I had Ranger school under me. I had a conventional Army like platoon leader time under me. So those are the two basic prerequisites. And essentially what was happening because of the wars, like it became a prerequisite that you had been downrange, that you had been in combat. Like you were just not going to be competitive for the Ranger Regiment.
Well, by that time, I mean, by 06, 07, whatever it is, when you officially get back, you know, I mean, you had 2 wars raging on for 6 years now. There was no reason at that point. Everybody, 75% of the Army had a combat patch on.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you didn't have a combat infantry badge,
right,
you weren't competitive for the Ranger Regiment. So like everybody, like in my course, in my like class for rope, right, this kind of their selection program, all like everybody had been downrange, everybody had a CIB, everybody had plenty of firefight stories. So that's kind of your baseline. But I go into essentially rope like within, I think about 3 weeks of getting back from Afghanistan. I'm still like pretty tore up, Mark. Like we literally were, I mean, it was such an intense deployment, 16 months out of a rucksack, like humping, fighting in those mountains, heavy casualties. You know, I was like, basically like we were all like starving to death, you know, like we had a hard time getting like food. We had a hard time getting water, you know, we're like out there scrounging food and, you know, so like we were very like broken down. And I just remember being like, not even sure that I could like pass a PT test, you know, and it's like you had to do, you know, like 5-mile run and like rucks and like all these things. There's all these fairly intense, like physical things you had to do at the beginning of rope. And I remember being like a little bit nervous about that because like fitness wise, I went, you know, you kind of start off, you're pretty fit and then you go to this insane fitness level in you know, in Afghanistan. But then as the tour goes on, you start to become like diminished. Like it starts to, like your body's breaking down, like your muscles breaking down, and you get, you know, you
didn't have ice cream in your chow hall. That's why.
Oh yeah, it was like
everybody on the cushy bases in Iraq got fatter because there was ice cream and cookies in the chow hall.
Right. So it was, you know, we were like, I came home and I was like, I was totally beat down. I remember being worried about passing, like just kind of like basic like physical events. But I, you know, I managed to get through everything fine. It was more, you know, challenging than it should have been for me. I was the type of guy that was usually just like blowing PT tests out of the water. Right. And then, you know, so I know it's kind of a long answer to your question, Mark, but we ended up, so I finished rope, right? I finished and they're like, okay, you got into Ranger Regiment, you're going to 2nd Battalion. And then I get to 2nd Battalion, right? Like again, I go to drum, like pack up my shit, and like me and Elizabeth, my wife, and I, like we fly across the country, like in my truck, drive across the country, drive to Fort Lewis. I get to Fort Lewis, kind of report. I'm like, hey, what's up? You know, and they're like, well, you know, everybody's downrange. They left a little while, you know, they just kind of left a little while back. And they were like, you want to go? Or you want to, you know, stay here and be like a little staff bitch? And I was like, no, I'm in, like, send me over there. So it was,
your wife was that answer.
Yeah. So within 2 months of getting back from Afghanistan for a 16-month tour, within 2 months, I was in Iraq. So yeah, it was, man, I tell you what, it was really bizarre. You know, it was, and just the juxtaposition of like Iraq and the Rangers and like Afghanistan and like 10th Mountain. I mean, that like military juxtaposition was really interesting. But to me, like what was really weird and strange was being home, like that little bit of time home after a war, and then like knowing I was going back to another one. Like mentally, I was in a really strange place, you know, where you like I never really turned off, and mentally, like coming off a deployment, like you know, you're kind of like, okay, you're trying to tell yourself psychologically, mentally, like shut down, like let it go, but knowing I was going back over too, you're like, okay, I can't totally like wind down, like I have to stay in this mode. So, you know, in effect, like the war never stopped. You know, it was just kind of home for a little while. And I think for my wife at the time, it was, you know, it was pretty rough to like deal with me, you know, who
I can imagine.
Yeah, who's still very much on patrol, who's still kind of on a mission, who's just got like, you got one foot back home, but you're really like, you're a ghost. You're a ghost. Like you're not really there. So yeah, anyway, but yeah, Iraq was the next one, Mark.
Where in Iraq are you?
Tikrit at first.
Okay. Up north.
Tikrit. Yeah. So kind of Sunni Triangle, like that whole hot area. That was the first trip.
What were you guys charged with there?
It was basically counterterrorism. I think our targets, like, so we were doing raids, right? Classic like Ranger Regiment missions. The Ranger Regiment had really transformed themselves into like from this big kind of like invasion force into like a raiding force, like a kind of a night raiding force. And we were going out basically every night and hitting targets. We were doing most of it by vehicles. Occasionally we do helicopters, but the nature of Iraq was, you know, you could kind of drive just as well as you could fly. So we were rolling out night raids, and our targets were, you know, mainly kind of Al-Qaeda affiliate and Al-Qaeda like members. There was some suicide bomber cells that we went after, a lot of very like high value kind of like enemy leaders, sort of your kind of tier 1 type targets.
Yeah.
So it was totally different game though, where it was night raids, fairly short raids, right? You go out for like a few hours. But the other thing like going on in Iraq at the time was like the war had, you know, again, it kind of like there was these ebbs and flows in the war, and it was at one of those high points where it was really, Iraq was really nasty at the time.
Oh yeah.
And everybody was fighting everybody, like the Sunnis and like the whole Sunni and like Al-Qaeda insurgency that was there. I mean, they were just going crazy. But then the Shia too, like there was Jaish al-Mahdi and Sadr, and like that whole group was like making a big mess at the time. And everybody was just shooting at everybody. And it was a total free for all, like where you could go out and you could literally, you might hit like 4 or 5 targets in a night, and you might kill like a dozen bad guys in one night. And like, nobody would even blink. Like, you know, whereas like, I remember Afghanistan, like my second tour, like, you know, like you went out and like did a raid and you like killed somebody, and like the next day, the whole province was talking about it. Like you were hearing from the government about it. You were hearing from their, you know, politicals about it. I mean, it was big news. But you could go out. There was a point in Iraq where you could go out and kill a dozen people in one night, and like nobody blinked. It was just the war was at such this like height at the time. So I caught that in 2007. That's when that was.
That's yeah. I mean, that was craziest time in Iraq, to say the least. Hence when the surge came in, because the violence was at its apex. So you guys had to deal with that. Level of casualties you sustained on the second deployment, anywhere near the first?
No. I think the battalion took some casualties. It was mainly like house clearing, where guys were getting shot, you know, where you were taking out, you know, it was kind of like those Al-Qaeda targets where like those dudes were like fight and die in place. Like they would throw down. So we lost guys like clearing houses and stuff. And then they're starting to do the houseborne like IEDs, where they'd like rig up a whole house. And they some of the smarter groups kind of knew that, you know, JSOC and, you know, the kind of the commando types were like after them. So they started like baiting us, you know, where they kind of knew how we were targeting them, like some of the technological things we could do. So they were setting big traps, and they'd rig up like whole houses to blow. So we had some casualties in the battalion, but the guys I was with, nothing, nothing, no casualties.
What was the biggest difference for you between going with the conventional unit and going in the Ranger Regiment? I mean, I understand that, for lack of a better term, the combat itself is completely different. As you mentioned, one's in the mountains, the other one's in a city, for the most part. But other than that, sort of, is there a noticeable difference between the way you deployed with a Ranger Reg versus a conventional unit?
Well, the Rangers was easy. It was so freaking easy. Honestly, it was like you had all the assets, you had good intel, you had very kind of focused missions, and you had a lot of, extremely high performing people. So, I would liken it to with the 10th Mountain Division, like that long tour. Like it was like I was as a platoon leader, as like a commander in combat. I was driving an old, like beat up pickup truck, and the transmission was going out, and then the engine had already been replaced like 3 or 4 times, and you had your tire rods broke every time you stopped, and you had flat tires every day, and that was it. And then in the Rangers, I got to drive a Ferrari. I was driving a Ferrari around. Yeah, it was what we were capable of was amazing, but it was easier. Physically it was easier. And then assets wise, right? My experience in Afghanistan with the conventional army was like, you basically had to have like a mass casualty event to get an aircraft to help you. And then we go out on targets with the Rangers. You'd have AC-130s, and then higher in the stack, you'd have, fast movers, maybe drones. You'd have, awesome intel. I mean, you always had eyes in the sky. So, in the Rangers, you just felt like you had all the angles, man. You had all the.
Which goes to show you what the Army prioritizes as important.
Right. Yeah. It was nuts, man. I was like, this shit is easy.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not, and I'm not downplaying like the risk, like some of the missions in the Rangers. I mean, they were hard, like pretty scary missions, like deep into enemy territory, like places where the conventionals, like we did this in Iraq a bunch, where like the conventionals, we gotta go, like nobody goes there. Like we just don't go to that area, period, because it's just too hot. And, you need basically a brigade to pull that off, and tanks and shit like that. And then we go do it. Like the Rangers would go do it. And that's what you're supposed to do, right? Like that's kind of the nature of those like special units. These like raids deep into enemy territory, like that's your mission. So I'm not downplaying the fact that there were some truly like dangerous missions, but I think just like kind of day to day, you felt like you were so much more supported than just the conventional infantry that would just get kind of thrown out there, and like you're on your own, man. Like again, no air, you didn't really have, a lot of backup. You didn't feel like you had a lot of help.
Did you have more close calls on the first deployment or the second one? I mean, the first one to Afghanistan, the second one to Iraq.
Yeah. First one for sure. Again, the second one was hot. I mean, we were killing lots of people, but it was just like, it was us shooting them first. Right. Whereas Afghanistan was a lot of times it was like the enemy was initiating contact. And so, I got wounded on the first tour. We had 50% casualties, and it wasn't because we were conventional infantry and like Rangers are Rangers. I think go ahead.
How'd you get wounded?
Oh, a rocket propelled grenade. Yeah. I just took an RPG in the face.
Nice.
Yeah. It was
killed well.
Yeah, it was a big firefight, and it hit. I was using this. I had this little skinny tree. I mean, literally the width of my thigh, right, for cover. And me and one of my team leaders were kind of using this tree for cover, and we were shooting back, and they let loose. RPG took the tree, hit the tree dead on.
Oh, wow.
Again, thigh size tree. I mean, this tiny little thing, and the RPG just basically like destroyed the tree. And then we were inside the fireball, like when it blew up, like we were inside it, and that was an intense experience, and I got, shrapnel really bad. I got my eardrum completely annihilated. And then, concussion, kind of bordering on TBI, but I think, cognitively I'm pretty good today. So it was, it was rough.
Essentially in a 2.5 year span, you've deployed twice. When you get home from Iraq the first time, there's not much left. You didn't do all that much time on active duty, brother. So how quickly are you back in the saddle?
Yeah. And what the Rangers were doing at the time was
you're probably only doing 7-8 months, right?
Yeah. You were doing, I think they were like 4 to 5 month tours in the Rangers. So they're definitely shorter. Right. So I did three tours of the Rangers, kind of the long one with Big Army, and then 3 tours of the Rangers. And the Ranger ones were like fairly short or comparatively short. 4 or 5 months is, it's kind of, that's long, in and of itself for a combat deployment. And then you were doing, you would do, right, like the way the rotations were working out, you do about 6 months at home, and then, kind of 4 months downrange, 6 months at home, 4 months downrange. So, I was active duty for like 5 years, and I was deployed for 2.5 of it, so basically half the time, deployed like to combat, like fighting. Right. And then there's the training, like all the kind of train up and that sort of stuff too. So I don't know, man. I like slept left. I like barely saw my wife. And that's just the kind of the phase that those 2 wars were in at the time.
So how quickly is your next deployment and where?
So the next one was back to Iraq, and it was with the Rangers. It was the Baghdad area, and this one was really interesting.
Where in Baghdad? Just out of curiosity.
Where?
Yeah.
Baghdad Airfield was our main kind of staging base.
Okay.
And then we bounced around a bunch, but it was Baghdad Airfield.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it was. Yeah,
I was over at RPC when I was there.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
So.
Well, that's in BIOP, man. Wow, what a crazy place. That's like I never really ever seen something like that before. Where it's like there's a whole like little city BIOP,
yep.
And you could go and it was like, there was like all the fast food and stuff, but there was like,
of course,
concerts all the time and like all this, like, it's like a little city over there, our own like little American city for the military. But we were there, and we were kind of like, we were on our own, like little secluded compound. Like we were like kind of the base within the base for, kind of the JSOC compound. And then, we operated out of there, but then we bounced around a lot. But what was interesting about that tour for me was this was a new special operations venture. So it was Rangers and SEALs in this big kind of strike force, organized in this big strike force, and we were all like working together and actually hitting targets like all together. It was like one big strike element. So a very big like strike force. We were capable of getting into some really, really nasty areas where it was like, you're not just going to fight the guys on target. You might fight the whole neighborhood. So we were kind of built for that, but it was Rangers and SEALs working together for the first time. And it was, kind of our target set were the agents of a foreign government, some really kind of hush hush stuff that I'm gonna be careful about kind of how much detail I go into, but what was so the missions were hairy, because it was, some of these areas where it's like you were going to fight everybody, like not just the guys on target. But what was the hardest thing about it was just like the basics of like inter-service rivalry and like SEALs and Rangers like trying to get along with each other. That was the hardest thing.
I was going to ask you next what that was like, because it becomes a big measuring contest, right?
Oh yeah. That was, from the very get-go, I laughed. Like I remember when we met the SEALs, like first we had a big like pissing contest about like who had to go to whose base for kind of the first, like, okay, we're all gonna kind of meet and work together. And there was this big row about who had to go to like whose base, right? And like we actually won that. The Rangers won that one. They came to our base, and I remember like the first meeting we had with them. We all kind of get, we all get in this big room, and it's like, oh, it's their brass and it's our brass, and the ground force commander, company, the company commander, platoon leader types, and they were senior NCOs. We all get in this room and we're all introducing ourselves, and everybody's like being so fucking hard about, you know, like their introduction, and like standing up, and like everybody's doing like the ultra deep voice, like I'm so badass thing. And it was funny because so that was like I remember our first meeting with them, and like everybody's like dropping names of like big ass operations and like things that they've done, you know, just to kind of be like, yeah, you know, like, you were in Afghanistan like early on, like, were you in Anaconda? Oh, you weren't in Anaconda. Oh, well, yeah, I don't even know what you were doing then. Like everybody's doing that, and like that started in the first meeting, and I don't think it ever really stopped, Mark. I mean, we kind of
I come in and like cut the tension in the room. I'm like, I'd be something like, you know, hey, I'm Captain Dirk Diegler. I was in Operation Boogie Nights. Great to meet you all. Have a good day. You know, like it's just, you know, that sort of stuff. I was like, yawn. You know, I get it, but I don't get it. You know, I understand it, but I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Nobody was winning this war by themselves. No one unit won the war by themselves. And so it always made me a little bit more perplexed. And I learned that more than anything in the special ops community, that it was never just about one individual, one team, everybody had their part of the pie that made everything successful.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that was, you know, a big job for me as like, you know, on the officer side, right? It was like, we got to make this work. Right. And we can't let this like ego shit and like, you know, well, you know, our kind of unit culture is better than your unit culture. Like, we can't let that derail the mission, right? Like, we gotta, you know, we gotta be big kids about everything. And so it was a success story. I think, you know, ultimately what we accomplished was like some of our operations actually like led to a ceasefire, like a bigger ceasefire with some of the huge militia groups. So wildly successful. But you know, just kind of night to night, it was pretty tough, man. Like we fight over, like, I'm sorry, Mark. Go ahead. But it's just like, hey, I'm being real, man. Like, it's not like, it's like ultra professional, you know, like, so we switch up like who is assault and who is isolation, right? Like who's taking the building, like who is holding back the neighborhood. We'd like switch that up, you know? So the idea was like, we would just go 50-50, like, but the thing we had was like, okay, you had to, like for it to count as like an assault night, as opposed to an isolation night. Mm-hmm. You had to hit a house. Like you had to actually, you know, get up in the house. So then we'd fight over like, well, that doesn't, you know, we went last night, but that was kind of more of a shed, or like, we never, it wasn't a house technically, you know, and like,
it's one floor. It's not a house. Right. You have to use stairs. It doesn't count as clearing it.
Yeah. Or, you know, some places it would be like super hot. And we were like, dude, we're going to get a big ass fight, like outside, like the target, he's some financier, like he's not going to fight, but like the neighborhood's going to fight. And so then it was like, oh no, we're isolation tonight. Cause like good dudes wanted to like throw down. Like that was like the type of people we had. So It was, you know, it was just kind of like sometimes it just, you felt like we were like, God damn, it's like, feels like we're like bunch of high school kids in high school or something, you know. Pretty
much. But I was going to say, you started to hint at it in your answer there. You kind of get this weird escalation where you start the conventional army, you go into the Rangers, and now you're working alongside SEALs. It's like, you know, each time you're trying to outdo yourself almost.
Oh yeah. It's you know, you just kept, like, I felt like I just, you know, kept getting better. I mean, you were key. Right. I just kept finding myself. And not by accident, like by design, like in you know, really at the tip of the spear, and doing things that I thought could like really move the needle. And you know, I always struggled with the kind of bigger like geopolitical goals over there, but I was always 100% convinced that like my unit and whatever given particular mission I had at the time, that we could move the needle, that like we really could make a difference. And it was like, I mean, it's simple as like, hey, okay, here's this terrorist cell. Let's kill all of them, or like capture. I mean, we'll capture some of them, but we can really do that. Like we can get them all. Like we can wipe this whole thing out. So, you know, I was always, you know, incredibly motivated kind of on the tactical side, while like, you know, like most soldiers, I think the bigger strategic and the political objectives, you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't care.
Well, I mean, that's interesting you say that, because my next question was simply, after this third deployment, and especially with the last two being to Iraq, you kind of had a sense of the lack of finality of the whole thing. Like, yeah, we can keep doing this, but guess what? We're going to continue to keep doing this. I mean, it didn't take a diplomatic genius or a political genius to realize that both the Afghan and Iraqi armies respectively weren't built to last. And so from that standpoint, was there any part of you after that third deployment that, was like, hey, I'm good. I've done enough at this point?
Yeah. Absolutely, Mark. I started to feel like you started to get a sense too, right? You do this, I was 4 years into it, and I was like, I don't see an end game necessarily. Like, it doesn't feel like we're progressing. And I think especially the people at the ground level could, particularly in Iraq, like you kind of see, or not in Iraq and Afghanistan, you were kind of seeing those like basic institutions, Iraq, the Afghan army, the Afghan police, and just, you was like, oh yeah, this isn't really going well with these guys. But to me, what like, very much moved me in the direction of, what are we doing? And are we really having an effect? Was I went back to Afghanistan for a fourth tour. Like, my fourth tour was back in Afghanistan, and I actually went to the same villages and the same valleys on that second tour.
How far apart was that years wise?
About four-ish, okay. 4 years, give or take, 4.5
Similar
years.
For me, I went to Baghdad twice, 5 years apart.
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, you talk about like wisdom and like getting like kind of a measuring stick on things. And I saw the same people, not just the same areas, the same villages, like, oh, I've driven on that road before. Like, I know at the roundabout you go in at the 6 out of the 3, like that's, but like, I saw the same people, the same, like, I was like, I remember that kid. Like, I remember him, and like, I remember this police chief, and, you're running into the same people who have basically been living in the war. And, it gives you, it definitely gives you some perspective on things. And for me, kind of the, my initial impression going back to Afghanistan for my second tour in Afghanistan, but fourth tour overall, was that things hadn't really changed a whole lot, like,
in fact, they had gotten worse.
Yeah. And it was like, this is like, tactically, strategically, this is a stalemate at best, so that was my kind of impression going back there.
Yeah. And I never thought much about were losses worth it or anything when I went back there the second time. I mean, maybe it's just because you're worried about your own sort of, self-preservation instinct. But, with hindsight being 2020, he asked me if going back there the second time to the same exact spot, I would have chosen to go somewhere else, because at least I wouldn't have felt like what I did the first time around completely gone.
Oh yeah. Yeah, man. I like, Mark, I don't want to get too negative here, but like, so I saw projects that I had started, like infrastructure projects, in my first tour as a platoon leader. And I saw those, like, I went back and saw those same projects, and they had basically fallen apart. Like, so there was there's extremely tangible, metrics there about, it was like, oh my gosh, like why didn't, like, that whole road building thing, like, it just totally went nowhere. And, so it's very, a huge emotional impact to kind of see that, where it's just like, Afghanistan, like, overall what we were trying to do, right, was we were trying to, as a country and as a society, we were trying to speed them through like centuries of social and technological change, and obviously it was just not, it wasn't really, some of our objectives, I think, were a little bit too ambitious. So
when you get back from your fourth deployment, do you know you're done? Like, hey, I've done enough deployments, I'm good.
Yeah, it had definitely like set in, where kind of on the way home from that fourth tour, and I had actually done a raid on a guy's house that had been a friend of mine from my first tour.
Oh,
and
wow.
I did a raid on his house as a Ranger. And, we tore some shit up. We broke some stuff. We broke some people. And, that I thought a lot about that. And, this guy who had been an ally, who had like sheltered us, who had like let us sleep in his home. And he'd been somebody who was, helped us out a great deal on my first tour. And then to kind of have him be a bad guy and to sort of be a target for my second, tour 4.5 years later, that was, that sort of put me into soul searching mode. And the other thing that was going on was, again, I was married and I had my wife and I could feel her, I could feel her kind of like pulling away in some ways, where it was just like and I think everybody went through this who was married, and I'm especially, I think it's really interesting, like the people who actually had kids. I didn't have kids at the time, but like I could feel her kind of moving away. And, just the kind of the strain of repeated deployments and just never really being around was, it was a lot. And so, that was definitely on my mind as well. And so ultimately, those two things, kind of seeing Afghanistan and where we'd sort of made some progress, where we hadn't made progress, seeing a friend who had sort of turned into an enemy, and then feeling my wife kind of pull away from me. Those things definitely factored into the decision, Mark.
Did anybody in the Army try to talk you out of it?
Yeah, it was heresy for like a Ranger officer, somebody
really?
who'd been in the regiment, to say, hey, I think I'm going to go maybe do some other things. That was, that was definitely frowned upon at the time, and I had some people too that, and this is not everybody, like, so I don't want to misrepresent it, but some people were basically like, they kind of turned their back on you. You're like, okay, you're not in the club
anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It's like blood in, blood out, man. You're like, so that hurt. And there's, honestly, Mark, there's even people today that, kind of, you sort of like reach out to, and it's like, hey man, we were downrange together, and, we went through some shit, and then you kind of, they're not really all that interested in talking to you. So that's a strange experience, but on the whole, I have a lot of like lifelong friendships and people that you're like, you may not see them for 4 or 5 years, but then you just pick up right where you left off, and you'll always be, closer than blood,
Yep.
so
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when do you get into writing?
It took me actually a long time. It took me like almost 10 years after I was done. And I think it's for the better. And like, I think a lot of people, it is kind of it's sort of there's a therapeutic aspect to it, right? It's kind of like the post-war guys who are, you're kind of processing a lot of things and you're coping with a lot of things. For me though, like, I'm glad that I waited a long time, because I think, having 10 years actually gave me a lot of wisdom about what happened. Absolutely. Where you're like, you could kind of find that like bigger meaning. I think if I would have tried to like start writing and like telling stories, like right after I gotten back, like right after I was done, or like right after any one of those tours, there was a lot of raw emotion. There was a lot of like anger. For me, there was a lot of anger, and there was a lot of like blame too. Like anytime you have the guys get killed, and some of that's like on me. It's it's on me. But there's kind of there's like that, there's poison in you, and you're kind of, you kind of throw that poison at other people too. And so I think waiting gave those memories and those experiences like time to mature for me. And ultimately, I think, kind of the storytelling and the writing was much better for it, where, it's not just kind of that initial like raw emotion from it.
Okay. So which one comes first, the memoir, We March at Midnight, or the actual novel?
The novel was first.
Okay.
I've always been a bookworm. I'm like a total nerd. And I used to write. I used to like read when I was over there. Like when I actually had energy. I didn't have a whole lot of energy, but I'd read books all the time. I'd read like novels. I'd read nonfiction. I never read like military stuff while I was over there, right? But it's kind of saturation. It's kind of like the guys that that are like playing Call of Duty when they're like downrange, and you're like, what are you doing? But anyway, so I read a lot. I did the novel first because I kind of love like fiction. So that's kind of like where my heart was, and that's where I started.
All right. So I'm always curious how authors write books, because it's not something I'll probably ever be able to do. But you're going complete fiction story. None of it has any basis. None of it is connected to you in any sort of way or anything like that.
Well, so, right. Like fiction is, I think most good fiction, like really good fiction, authentic stuff, like it starts with what's real. It starts with real things and real people. And then the thing that's fun about it is you get to use your imagination, right? Like, so your baseline, your dough is real things. And then you use your imagination. You can kind of like, in my mind, get to much like deeper truths and like much deeper like wisdom and observational power than you can necessarily with like nonfiction, where you're kind of bound to like reality. So my novel was obviously, it was primarily based on that first tour in Afghanistan, which was, for me, was the hardest thing I ever did. There was nothing will ever be as hard. That was, truly this sort of formative experience for me. And so that was the basis for my novel.
When you want to sit down and write the memoir, well, before I get to the memoirs, how quickly did you know the novel was going to be a success?
So when you're a debut author, everybody thinks that they're gonna like be a bestseller, like you're gonna be the next like Marmontes and like have freaking you're gonna be the next Matterhorn, and it was that's not usually the case. But I won a national award, like basically military novel of the year from the American Library Association. But it took a little while for that to happen. And I think most authors, you believe, like your whole heart is in it. And so you believe that you're going to be the next like mega bestseller and you're going to win all the awards. But, in reality, that's not necessarily how it works out. But I thought I had something like, pretty special and unique, and I was able to step away from it too and kind of be like, hey, there's not a lot out there that kind of has this angle that I've taken. And so I was always confident that it was gonna do well, but I was surprised when I got the award, obviously. So
that's pretty amazing. Congratulations. Yeah. Do you think if you don't get the award, you're not writing the memoirs, or is something else the sort of impetus for deciding to put all the military stuff down on paper?
Yeah, I think the award like helped me, kind of give you that little boost in motivation. But I think the memoir was always there for me, and it was something I wanted to do. I felt like I had some pretty wild like stories, and I had an experience that like I thought other people too could kind of relate to, and I really believe, Mark, that the best stuff that comes out of the wars is written by the people who have been there but have had some space from it, kind of like to my point of like writing it 10 years later. Like I think that's the best stuff. So there, there was that motivation was there, and I felt like I was like, I'm at the right time where like I can say things and I have observational power that maybe other people haven't kind of brought to the storytelling quite yet. So
was there one story in the memoir that was tougher to write about than others?
Well, I struggled with actually an event where I wasn't physically there, and I will always feel an incredible sense of like responsibility. We had guys get killed. It was frequent in my first tour, but the hardest thing for me to write about was I actually went on mid-tour leave. And when I was on mid-tour leave, my platoon got kind of pushed into something, like into a mission that I thought was flawed in many ways. And I had, essentially two guys killed that I held in very, very high regard. And I made tactical mistakes downrange. I am not perfect, and I don't present myself as perfect in any of like my storytelling, but not being, I just always felt like this sense of responsibility because I wasn't like there. And when I wasn't there, like something happened that, I felt responsible for. Like if I'd have been there, that wouldn't happen to those guys. And so, there's that sort of, that thing, even though like, again, I didn't like see those guys like bleed out, with my own eyes, but like that was sort of hardest to like deal with. Kind of the memory of that was really, really tough, Mark.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's sometimes the hardest things are the things that you can't control, because the only thing in combat you get any sort of sanity from is what you think you can control, when in reality we all know you really control next to nothing in combat. But our training and our minds allow us to believe that we do have a measure of control, or at least we try to hold on to what we can control for as long as we can control it. Because again, that gives us, in certain cases, fire superiority. It gives us cover and concealment. It gives us a whole bunch of things that's an advantage against the enemy, because that's what we're trained to believe it will do. But again, in reality, we've told dozens of stories on this podcast. An inch to the left, an inch to the right. You take one step this way versus one step that way, and look how different things could be. There's just no telling how anything is ever going to work out in combat. So, I understand and empathize with the feeling of where you were and how you feel about it. It's just a reminder that it is the most random thing in the entire world, and that is combat. And there's literally no control over anything, because in reality, you could have been there and could have done nothing to stop it as well.
Yeah, or it's possible you could have made it. You could have made it worse.
Worse, yeah.
And those tactical decisions will always be with me. And I've tried to, I've tried to like rationalize my way out of them. I've tried to like kind of fit it all together and be like, okay, no, it's okay. Like forgive yourself. And I haven't gotten there, Mark, on,
really?
No, I haven't, man. I haven't. Like like I said, I've got wisdom about what happened, but there's some things that I feel like, again, tactically, I made the call. Somebody died, or somebody got, catastrophically wounded. And it's that'll always be there with me. And you kind of learn to cope with it, but I haven't ever gotten like, closure. And even guys, man, there's a guy that, he was horribly burned. There's actually a few of them, and some others were killed too in the same firefight. And, because of some tactical calls I made that day, I felt like the enemy was able to sort of initiate this horrific ambush. And it was my tactical decisions that sort of precipitated this. And, this guy is, I don't know, like he's going to live with this forever. He's going to live with it forever. And I don't quite know how to square all that up, man. Like I can't give him back. I can't give him his skin back. I can't give him his like face back. And, I don't know, man. I don't know that I don't know how he feels. Like, I don't ever felt like there was like that kind of that hate from him or that blame from him. Like, I thought I never got that from him, but like, I don't know. I kind of, it made it self-generated, but
yeah, I mean, I would guesstimate that if he were sitting here right now talking to me, and I had asked him if you could switch places and give your condition to, Captain McPadden or anybody else in the platoon, would you do it? He would say no. And so I think from that standpoint, anybody who gets wounded, sure, they would love to not be wounded, but unfortunately, the intent of combat is to wound one side or the other, right? Wound or kill one side or the other. And so from that standpoint, if it wasn't him, it would have been one of his platoon mates, and he wouldn't trade that for anything. That's what I gather from multiple years of hearing these stories and telling people, having people tell their stories. And asking that question, are you mad? Are you angry? Do you feel guilty? And usually people default to, well, if it meant one of the other guys in my unit would have gotten it, no, I would have done the same thing over again. Because kind of that's what we're also trained to believe. Sure, there are folks who, we could talk about many of the folks we interviewed from Cop Keating who would gladly tell their superiors, what the hell were you thinking putting us down in this valley? But in the same respect, they understand the mission and this is what it is. And in the big picture, none of them felt like they were sent there to be killed, but not everybody survived. And it's unfortunate, but it's just that, I don't think any of those decisions matter in actual fighting, right? When bullets are flying, no one's concerned with who made a strategic decision or a tactical decision or even an operational decision. When you're fighting, you're worried just about staying alive and taking care of the buddy next to you. So when you have time to sit back and reflect on all those things, yeah, you can second guess it to the nth degree. And you can analyze it and triple question it and quadruple question it over and over again. But you'll come up with the same answer for more often than not, is that you just don't have a lot of control over this stuff sometimes. And as callous as it may seem, if you'd like to make an omelet, eggs are going to break. And unfortunately, that means people are going to sustain casualties in war. It's just the way it is. It's just part of how our entire ecosystem of the military and war are. And from that standpoint, I think we do a very good job. We could always do better, but we do a very good job internally of preparing each other for losses in combat. We don't do a very good job after the fact down the road of hashing all that crap out, right? And doing a brain dump on all that stuff. But understanding my part of the pie, your part of the pie, and what could happen to me could happen to you. We wouldn't trade it if it means we were better. Yeah, I think that's pretty much a fair assumption for what it's worth. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah. No, thanks, Mark. I think those are great points. And yeah, nobody there is there against their will. Like none of us were drafted into the infantry. Right. And, for me, again, it's like, hey, if I get killed, like this is what I wanted to do, I think, again, forgiveness is important. It is.
And forgiving yourself,
Yeah. And that's where I think, sort of like other people that I was upset with about, like things that happened, like that things have healed up. And then I think with time too, you kind of go like, I understand the situation. I understand the tactical decisions and like, like if anything, my admiration has grown for people, like as time has passed, but I still struggle with that, that kind of sort of self-forgiveness, or you tell yourself, you've convinced yourself it's all good. And then, just something happens and it just kind of comes creeping back in.
Yes. And it always will, but
yeah.
There's a skill there that you as an individual and anybody who suffers from that stuff needs to learn as an individual and how to cope with that and how to deal with it over the course of time. But I wanted to ask you in reference to the memoir, if you had to summarize it, what do you want people to take away from We March at Midnight?
Well, I think the big thing for me was like, I actually wanted to put people like there and like sort of like give them an adventure story, because that's what this always was for me. It was an adventure story. And I think the thing that kind of shines through is the like the American spirit, like the Rangers and the soldiers that I fought with. It's, some of the finest human beings, on the planet, and, their ingenuity, their courage, was always, that was kind of the story I wanted to tell, was about just like people who endured incredibly difficult things and then like thrived in those situations. And Mark, what I think like I really wanted to shine a spotlight on that makes things sort of different is like the GWAT, we had a lot of men and women that volunteered and then that like went back and forth multiple times. And for me, I think it's really easy to be brave like the first time you go to war. I think it's easy to be brave when you don't understand the stakes. But for the people who like kept going back, the people who got banged up, who got wounded, who saw loss and kept going back, I think it takes far more courage to keep going back. And the men and women that had kids and families and like really understood the stakes but kept doing it, that to me was always amazing. I think I was raised on a on kind of like this, and this is very popular in kind of like big media and the kind of the stories that get attention is like there's these singular event type stories, like this mission and this like Medal of Honor thing where this guy kind of ran through the machine gun fire to grab his buddy, right? And like that's that's heroic. But I think for me, what's like true, another form of that, and I think a deeper form of heroism is the people who understand the stakes, who understand, you can lose everything and like keep doing it. So that was kind of the story I wanted to tell. It wasn't just like that, okay, here's this one like really high profile mission that people have heard about in the news, but more about like the people who kind of keep going back over and over again.
Yeah. And I think there was a military philosopher who said it, I forget, and Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, had echoed those same sentiments, that you can convince any man to go into battle once. It's getting them to go back a second time that ultimately is the most difficult challenge that you can have. And certainly, again, you and I both understand it, as do many other people who have appeared on this podcast. But one of the things you do say in We March at Midnight is that you're at war with yourself. Can you describe that a little bit? And do you feel like you still are at war with yourself?
Yeah, to some extent, yes. I think you're like, everybody kind of has like, you get demons, you get demons from like what you've seen, what you've experienced. And you got to control those demons, man. And they can win, they can win. There's a lot of stories out there where kind of that darkness wins. And so to me, it's about like kind of the endurance of fighting, but then also just kind of like, mentally and psychologically, winning against yourself. And, as I said, like, forgiveness, I think is a big part of that. And, finding kind of other things that you love and that you can put your energy into, family, being obviously a very common example. Those are critical, I think, to kind of like use the war experience and get better from it. Right. And not have the war experience be a handicap for the rest of your life. Right. If your rite of passage breaks you, then what are you, man? So that's kind of how I, that's sort of how I approached it. Right. Was, I think, look for ways to make, that this has made you better, as opposed to kind of fixating on, here's the negative things that will kind of always be with me. And, that can handicap people, and it can quite honestly destroy people. So it can be very dangerous.
How do you end up becoming a Pat Tillman scholar?
I'd always been like a really good student.
No, you said you were a nerd. Just call yourself a nerd.
I know. Yeah. So I like school. I like reading, and I was a nerd, man. Like I really was like, so like I played like high school football and I did boxing. I did like sports at a really high level. It was very good.
Don't try and change the narrative now.
Yeah. But like, it's like deep down, man, I was a nerd. Like I did really well in school. And like I remember my friends would like give me shit about it. And like, I was like, oh, schoolboy, like that kind of thing. And then I was like scared of girls. And there's a lot of like things where I think I didn't quite like fit the jock stereotype very well, but so like I always liked school, and then I did really well like grade wise, and I knew about Pat Tillman. Like, who didn't know about Pat Tillman, at least in kind of like our our age group. And so I like applied for the scholar, kind of their scholarship program, and had really good grades, had the military experience, had been in combat, and then told them a lot about kind of like what I wanted to do, what my kind of some of my bigger career and life goals were, and that sort of helped me secure a scholarship with them and be one of that group of people. And so it was a tremendous honor for me. And it's not just about school, right, and like grades and academics. It was a big community focus with that, the Tillman Foundation.
Absolutely. I mean, you're part of two elite groups now, Army Rangers and Pat Tillman scholars. So it all works out well for you.
Yeah. And they, that helped put me through grad school. And that's what I needed. That was part of we talk about kind of mentally like coming out of the war and then, getting better from it, right? Like building off of it as opposed to spiraling kind of in the other direction. And, the grad school and the Tillman Foundation kind of like, because they made that like real for me, that put me on the, on a trajectory to, success. And so I'm incredibly indebted to them. And, I can't say enough about kind of, advanced education. I think the post 9/11 GI Bill's a fantastic vehicle. And then, there's a lot of groups out there, Tillman Foundation was the route I went, but there's a lot of like groups out there that kind of help in veterans, education wise, which I think again is incredibly important. Old infantry guys, Rangers, you're like, yeah, that shit's badass. You get to, your cool guy stuff, right? But like in the outside world, a lot of stuff doesn't really translate all that well. Like you don't have those really like concrete, kind of like a concrete technical skill that maybe like a nuclear tech in the Navy has, that you can sell. So I think, advanced education is kind of the path to, successful reinvention and like your ability to kind of have a fulfilling life. That's at least my story, Mark.
Yeah. I agree with you on higher education. However, for me, I already have a master's degree. If they send me to war college, I'll get another one. And I have no use for either one of them. So, hey, listen, I host a podcast, right? Like, what do I do? I mean, it's what it is. So,
well, yeah, I mean, that was definitely like as an undergrad, I was like, whatever, I don't know. I just want to go to war and be an officer. And I just, kind of screwing around. And, but yeah, like whether your exact degree, whether you end up, truly using that is I think it's probably like 50-50, right? There's a lot of people who never even like touch it. It's more of just having a qualification, than actually, necessarily, using it. Wait, by the way, what'd you do the master's in?
I got my first one in organizational leadership.
Yeah, nice.
So an MS in organizational leadership. And I only got it to be competitive for promotion. Like literally I've worked in radio and television my entire, like it's a business to see students. Nobody has a master's degree. Some people don't even have a college degree, let alone, a master's. And I'm going to end up with two of them, knock on wood, if I end up going to war college. And,
nice. Yeah, nice. Well, leadership's the one thing. I'm talking about how, I'm saying like, a lot of this stuff doesn't translate. And, I'm sort of oversimplifying, but right. Like the leadership piece is always like the one thing from the military that like that translates, right? Like you can take that as a skill set that most people never, no matter what kind of training, what kind of schooling you've done, like you can never kind of quite get that the way you can get that especially from like an army or a military at war, like that's, and absolutely priceless experience.
What's next for you? More books, more family time? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, more books. I'd love to go back into novels and nonfiction. That's a cool world. And I work in Yellowstone National Park. I'm here in the West. I love the West. I love the mountains. So I could see myself doing something, maybe set here in the States, in the West, and some of these last like wild places we still have.
Well, listen, man, it's awesome that you reached out to us. I think it's great that you wanted to tell your story. I think it's an amazing story at that, and your journey. And look, we did 90 minutes. It went by in the blink of an eye. So I certainly appreciate you stopping by and sharing it with us. Can people reach out to you on social so they can get your books at Amazon, all Barnes and Noble, every outlet store there is?
Yeah, all the big outlets, right? It's available. I'm at RrayMcPadden.com on the web, and then Ray McPadden 1 on Instagram.
All right. Well, again, We March at Midnight is the memoir, and the book itself, the fiction novel, and the whole Mountain Burned. Again, winner of the W.Y. Boyd Literary Award for Excellence in Military Fiction. Ray, again, thank you so much for your time, brother. It's great to hear from you. Continue to consume the podcast. We're glad you're a fan, but we had a blast telling your story, and we certainly appreciate you being part of the Hazard Ground.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on. My pleasure.
All right, take care.
You've been listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.